asignados y ya estamos grabando. Éxitos.
Ok, gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Vamos a iniciar la sesión de la tarde. Vamos a tener nuevamente el gusto de poder escuchar y disfrutar la presentación de Gabriele Koehler. Originalmente yo le había planteado a Gabriele la importancia de considerar esta sesión como un taller para que pudiera tener mejor, digamos, posibilidades de trabajar instrumentos con ustedes, pero en el debate que tuvimos con Gabriele había dos requisitos que no iban a darse. Uno es que ella necesitaba, que es lo que va a hacer en la presentación, darles el marco de derechos humanos como una alternativa indispensable que ella considera para proponer políticas alternativas diferentes para enfrentar los desafíos que planteó en la sesión del lunes, estas disfuncionalidades globales que se expresan en temas de cambio climático, en términos de crecimiento de la desigualdad, en términos de las cadenas globales de valor, la emergencia de países con regímenes autoritarios que amenazan las libertades y los sistemas democráticos, por solo mencionar algunas de ellas, el deterioro de los sistemas de protección social, la dualidad y fragmentación, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, esa era la primera restricción. La segunda, que exigía que los estudiantes, ustedes, tuvieran unas lecturas previas. Entonces optamos por una segunda conferencia en la cual va a ser más breve que la anterior, para que quede más tiempo de debate, de preguntas y debate entre ustedes y ella sobre las dos presentaciones, digamos, la que ustedes escucharon el lunes y la que van a escuchar ahora. Esta presentación, al igual que la primera, va a tener traducción simultánea. Si ustedes no la activaron, debajo, en la parte inferior de la pantalla, de sus pantallas, van a ver un símbolo de interpretación. Ustedes hacen clic y allí escogen el idioma en el cual quieren escuchar la presentación. Por lo tanto, le agradecemos a Gerardo y Cintia, que son los dos traductores, por su trabajo de traducción. Y vamos nuevamente, para quienes no estuvieron en la sesión del lunes, a hacer una muy breve presentación, esta vez de Gabriele. Gabriele es economista del desarrollo, es actualmente investigadora asociada al Instituto de Investigaciones de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Desarrollo Social, que tiene sede en Ginebra y en Bonn. Ella es de nacionalidad alemana, tiene un doctorado y una muy vasta experiencia de trabajo en distintas agencias de Naciones Unidas, muchos años de trabajo en el sector de Asia-Pacífico, fue representante coordinadora del sistema de Naciones Unidas durante muchos años, representante del PNUD, representante de UNTAD en Ginebra, ha trabajado para UNICEF y actualmente también ha sido electa como integrante del Comité de Alemania para UNICEF, Comité Nacional, y además es una militante y activista por los derechos de la mujer, a la equidad, al género, etc. Entonces, Gabriele, after this presentation, we are anxious to listen to your presentation.
Thank you so much for your generous introduction. And I'm so happy to see all of you again on my little squares on top of my laptop screen. And I will do a short recap of what we did last time, and then I'll spend about 40 minutes talking about issues around human rights. And then the main part really tonight, or today as it were, as it is for you, is to have a lively discussion and debate and to question different theories. So let me share my screen. Yes, good. Can you see? Is it visible? Yes. Okay, so today it's about the normative frameworks that we may or may not have and that we may or may not want to use to address all the crises and dysfunctionalities that we were talking about. So I'll just briefly recap about the crises and then what can be done, and can we use these different human rights and ILO frameworks for remedial action or actually for structural change, and what is the role of progressive governments? We won't talk about that very much, but what is the role of civil society, and what is your role as academics? Now, last time I showed you this overview by UNRIS, the UN Research Institute for Social Development, which sort of listed all these different types of crises. And our question was, where do we start? You know, they're all obviously interrelated. And my contention was that the most important driving factor, structural factor for all the inequities, for all the dysfunctionalities, for all the social injustice is the lack of decent work, and you know, which also is related to a lack of social protection. But obviously all these other crises are very structural and forming all these different inequities. And in very recent times now, we're seeing how political instability and violence, violent conflict, even open wars are undermining even the very notion of what would be a fair and just and transparent society. Last time I showed you this, this map of rising authoritarian, and I'm sorry, someone rightly remarked that Russia on that one was blank. You see, there's always one country blank, so whenever I download this from Civicus, for some reason one country goes blank, because you can then click it and see what their situation is. So of course, Russia appears here correctly as a repressed society. And we can see mainly in Asia and northern parts of Africa and in the Gulf states, we have entirely closed economies, or societies rather, and then so much of the world is actually repressed in the sense that all the different political, civil and political rights are not in place, from right to have a trade union, from free press, from some sort of free elections, and from a lack of corruption, etc. So we have this issue that we have all these different crises which would actually need good governance in order to address them properly, but we have an increasing number of countries that are not democratic. And today, sadly, we saw that in the Philippines also. The election didn't go the way which I didn't hoped it wouldn't go, and I presume many of you also were disappointed. So my question tonight is, or today is, does the UN system offer answers, or at least instruments, so that we can address these inequities and these dysfunctionalities? And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on looking at what is the architecture, what is the structure or the availability of international norms to address all these crises, looking at human rights and labor standards, human rights conventions and labor standards. And it's important analytically, but also politically, to make two distinctions, or to make a distinction between binding agreements and voluntary norms. This is what I'm referring to as the UN system at this point. So binding agreements are binding treaties that get adopted by member states and then have to be ratified in each country's parliament, and then of course have to be implemented. It's also about international labor organization core labor standards, same process. There has to be a convention, it then needs to be adopted and ratified in each country, and then enter into force through implementation. But interestingly, also the Paris Agreement on climate change, the 1.5 degree commitment, is a binding agreement. And there are, of course, many others. These all, as I mentioned, need to be ratified multilaterally to enter into force, and then by the parliaments of each country to become justiciable, so that when we can claim them. They also need to be implemented, not just to be there as, a fancy declaration, and that needs peer pressure and public pressure. Voluntary norms, surprisingly, the human rights declaration, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, is actually voluntary. It's not ratified by countries, but it's understood that any country that joins the UN system would be notionally committed to those norms. So everything that comes from the UN General Assembly or these UN summits, these declarations and agendas like the SDGs, which we'll see later, they are voluntary. There's a periodic review of the Human Rights Council, which I'll describe a little bit later, or norms at the WHO, standards on breast milk feeding, or how do you say, substitutes for breast milk, or norms on how can how can pharmaceutical companies be on the board of the WHO. Those are voluntary. These voluntary norms have more of a guiding role because they're not enforceable. They're much easier to get. They're not as threatening, but they too need a lot of public pressure and peer pressure to work. The genesis of all of these human rights and labor standards, be they voluntary, be they binding, usually come from civil society or trade union movements. And very frequently they come as we have a catastrophe, as we have a big crisis such as world wars, and then member states of the different agencies realize that something needs to change. And we'll see that over the past 100 years, we've been having this process of human rights declarations in the broad sense. But they come and go, they stop and go in their adoption. So quickly, just to look at the binding norms, they, in my view, are the optimal way to anchor rights because they can become justiciable or claimable. They define the obligations of the state. And interestingly, they have a century-old history, but progress, as I said, is stop and go. And I have this tree as a symbol. We have the binding commitments, binding treaties, covenants, conventions, and then we have the voluntary ones. And we need both parts of the tree really to get human rights to be leading us to better governance. So interestingly, in 1919, after the end of World War I, and in the whole 1920s, we saw a whole slew of conventions from the newly created International Labour Organization. One of the very first one, the number 2 of conventions of the ILO, is this Migrant Workers' Rights Convention, because it was observed that so many people after the war were moving, and also there was the whole Reconstruction challenge, if you will. And so the ILO managed to adopt a convention that everybody should have be insured against unemployment and have social insurance and have good working conditions. They didn't call it decent work in those days, but that's sort of by implication. And something that always strikes me, it's been 100 years, over 100 years, that we have this Maternity Protection Convention, which is about paid maternity benefits. This is 1919, this is not 2019, 1919, so over 100 years ago, benefits for full and happy maintenance of healthy maintenance of the mother and her child, meaning some kind of maternity benefit. So for 100 years, we've been fighting for that. And as you saw last week last Monday on that slide, maternity protection is actually still not implemented even 100 years later. Although I think it's something you don't even have to be a feminist to understand that this is really a basic right. So in the 1920s, there were a lot of ILO conventions. And then in 1944, it was already during World War II, we had the tragedy of this war and the genocide and the enormous destruction and the persecution and the displacement of people. And the ILO, again, was very important in adopting the Philadelphia Declaration concerning, what is the ILO actually there for? and saying that one of the key goals was full employment and raising the standards of living and also social security. I could also, if we had more time, go into the fact that also in 1944, the World Bank and the IMF were created. So there was also meant to be a World Trade Organization out of Havana. So in the 540s, still during World War II, it was giving the horrors of the war and the recognition of the power of powerful states that something needed to change in the world order to prevent new forms of fascism coming up, to preventing imperialism. It was important to have decent work and good labor standards and good governance. So there were there was this impetus. And again, we see after World War II, we see there were so many refugees, so there was a refugee convention, and there was also a migration convention, which I didn't list here, but I can send you information on that. So a lot was happening immediately after World War II. Then nothing happened for a long time, because after the major powers, the permanent five of the today's Security Council of the UN, after they started disagreeing with each other and fighting with each other, they actually hindered the UN to really do its job. The UN was created in 1945, but until 1966, it was not possible to get very much adopted in terms of human rights work. And then in 1966, after long negotiations, decided to have two covenants, and covenants are binding, one on political and civil rights and one on economic, social, and cultural rights. And the political divide was that the Soviet bloc and China said the most important thing is to assure economic, social, and cultural rights, never mind about political rights, whereas the US and the Western European countries were saying, no, it's about having political and civil rights, having democracy, and from that will then follow the possibility to claim economic and social cultural rights. It was meant to be one big covenant, and because one couldn't agree, one then made two, and at least one had then in the 1960s this legal instrument to work. Then again, so this was 1966. Then more than a decade passes, and finally one gets the Convention on the Rights of Women, on the eradication of discrimination against women, as a result of the stronger and stronger women's movement, which, in our case, in our interest of decent work, so it states the right to work, free choice of profession, equal remuneration, and social security. So it was, apart from equality as overarching standard, also had made a lot of points around decent, our concern of decent work. Again, another decade passes, the rights of the child were adopted, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, again stemming from a very long history of child rights movement. Of course, here it's not the right to work, but the opposite, to have minimum age provisions, and if older children are working, to have regulation of the hours of employment, and most importantly, for children to be protected from economic exploitation. And again, as we saw last week, there's still 160 million children in child labor. So even this one, which is such a basic, it's a bit like the right to maternity leave, the child rights are still not really realized. Migration became an issue again because of globalization. I would argue that globalization in its current form really took off in the early 1980s. And so by 1990, one succeeded in having a UN International Convention on the Protection of Migrant Workers. And this particular convention is unique because it actually talks both about regular and irregular or undocumented migrants, and says that they have equal rights to the host population, to workers also from the country itself. And at the same time, one wanted to eliminate the illegal work of the irregular migrants and also prohibit their expulsion. Again, we're far away from achieving that. So, in a very short recap, at the moment on the human rights from the UN system, human rights side, we have 9 treaties that are considered as the core treaties. It's the eradication of racial discrimination. It's the covenant that I mentioned on economic, social, and cultural rights. It's the one on civil and political rights. It's the CEDAW for women. It's about the prevention of torture. It's the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's the migrant workers and their families, the right for the worker to have her family with her, the rights of people with disability, and the right to not, or the prohibition of enforced disappearance. So people being kidnapped and forced into slavery. So 9 human rights treaties from the UN side. And the ILO, of course, is part of the UN, and they have 8 what they call the fundamental ILO conventions. Obviously, the freedom of association, to have trade unions, the freedom of these trade unions to bargain for decent wages and decent work standards. The Forced Labor Convention, which is the only one that predates World War II from these core fundamental ILO conventions. Abolition of forced labor, the minimum age, the prohibition of the worst forms of child labor, the equal remuneration, this is about equality of pay, and then the Convention on the Discrimination in Employment. So those are the 8 from the ILO and the 9 from the UN. Another binding treaty, so all of these are binding if they are ratified in the country concerned, in each country concerned. And then another binding arrangement is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which I'm sure you're all very aware of, with the attempt to limit the raising of the temperature to 1.5 degrees is now current. And as you might have read today, the World Meteorological Society organization of the UN, they just published a report that actually we're off track even for the 1.5, which by now everyone knows is a tipping point if we exceed that. And when I say that the Paris Agreement is binding, the agreement as such entered into force, but to be applicable, it again needs to be ratified in each country. And then what the countries do is they have a text called a nationally determined contribution, and that's what's binding. But what countries lay down as their determined contribution to reducing CO2 emissions, etc., what they actually determine, what they actually agree to do in each country is not, there's no one fixed route, partly because there's arguments about what exactly is the cause of climate change. And there, as we saw last week, we have the International Panel on Climate Change, which in the past few years has actually made it much more clear that climate change is man-made and what the measures are that would be needed. So interestingly, this Paris Agreement on climate change also talks about decent work. You'd think it would only talk about climate. It actually also talks about decent work. And a big point is about the just transition. So this would be that obviously if we move out of carbon-based types of occupation and employment and activities, the people who are employed in those sectors of the economy need to have the training, the opportunity, the wherewithal to move into green jobs, other types of jobs, into services. And this has to be just in the sense of equitable, it has to be fair. There's a right to development in that text, the empowerment of women. So it's actually a very interesting text to read because it goes beyond just the narrow climate change kind of discussion. A few other conventions that are binding, just to mention the one on indigenous and tribal peoples, and the one on persons with disabilities, living with people living with disabilities. And there's a plan to have a UN convention on the rights of the aged, which is under negotiation in the UN in New York. There's an ILO convention on homework, which is actually the work that takes place in these global value chains and these global production chains. It was adopted in the mid-1990s. And then we have the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers. These two always sound a bit as though they were the same thing, but this is people producing those intermediate products in the global value chains, but producing them in their homes in a very informal fashion. And domestic workers is women and men who work in other people's homes in the care, basically the care economy. There's a plan to have a UN convention or an ILO convention on decent work. I think that would be very, very tough to get that even into this drafting stage of a convention. But it would be so important, and it would really change so much. And also actually already in negotiation, and I'm going to say a bit more about that towards the end of my talk, is the UN Binding Treaty on Business and Human Rights, which is exactly about how do we refetter these global production chains? How do we ensure that labor standards, human rights, environmental standards are maintained by transnational companies, by countries moving across borders? Okay, so we have these 9 human rights treaties. We see here total country ratifications. So for the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, 170 countries out of about 193 UN member states have adopted. Much better the one on the rights of women, 189. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely adopted convention. There are only 2 countries in the world who have not adopted it or ratified it rather. One country is the US and the second country is Sudan. Not as widely adopted, but pretty good still, is the one on disability, but very, very poor traction for the Convention on the Rights of Migrants and their Families, because this is, again, that's why I'm thinking, if there were ever a convention, if we were ever to get a convention, a binding treaty, some binding commitment on decent work, it would be so difficult. And we see that here, that even the migrants, who are such a large part of so many economies, that very few countries are actually willing to say that they have rights, that they and their families have rights. And if we look at the ILO labor conventions, we see very, very low traction. So that's why I'm asking, do we have these instruments of the UN system, including the ILO, but then are they actually being used, and how can we make them used better, more, used more? And so the Maternity Convention of 1919, still only 34 countries adopted. The Homework Convention about global production chains, 10 countries have adopted it. The Domestic Workers Convention, 30 countries. And so if we say the UN, the universe of countries is 193 countries, we can see that there's very, very low commitment by the member states of the UN to these labor conventions. How does it look for the Paris Agreement? In Glasgow last year, in the autumn, there was the Glasgow Convention of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The countries observed that all of these national commitments, these agreed commitments that countries are meant to be making, are falling far behind the 2-degree goal, and even more so the 1.5-degree goal. The international financing that was promised to low-income countries so that they could actually adapt and mitigate for climate change and receive 100 million, which is not very much per year, is not materializing. And so there's huge arguments over who is actually responsible for climate change. And if you remember that champagne glass from last time, that the highest income countries and the highest income people on the globe account for 50% of global emissions, if we take CO2 emissions as one core issue in climate change, whereas the 3.5 billion people of the population, of the planet's population, who are the most affected by climate change, only use 10% of these resources. And so the argument is from the global south that the global north, that has caused historically and currently so much of the negative climate impact, they're meant to be redressing these issues and compensating the global south. And this is a sticking point in the negotiations. I mentioned this last time, 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in hotspots of high vulnerability, and the prospects are further limited if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees. And you know all about the sea level rise, about droughts and enormous storms and hurricanes and tsunamis, etc., that are especially harmful always to those people who live in the most vulnerable situations. So that was sort of one branch of the tree, the binding. And then if we quickly look at voluntary norms, sometimes called soft law, it also usually reacts to shocks. Again, we need peer pressure and public pressure. They're more sexy in the sense that there's more public awareness. So the SDGs are an example. I think most people in sort of development set kind of groups or in academic settings, they've heard of the SDGs, but they're not claimable. So they're easier to get because they're not so threatening, but they're not justiciable, they're not claimable. So surprisingly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, just after the UN was created, is not binding. It's just a voluntary, by acclamation, by accession, by joining the UN implicitly one agrees. But with respect to my question around the decent work, there is a right to work, free choice of employment, and protection against unemployment. So that would be social protection, no discrimination, favorable remuneration, and the right to join trade unions. 1948, so we have to see that was a period after World War II where very powerful countries were in such shock that they agreed to quite progressive terms and conditions. Nothing happened for a very, very long time. So this is 1948. And finally, in 1993, there was a Vienna Declaration Program of Action on Human Rights. 1993, as you know, is after the Cold War notionally ended, after 1989, 1991. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the then Soviet Union. And finally, in the early 90s, the UN was able to get this Human Rights Convention, or not convention, sorry, declaration adopted, saying that human rights are indivisible and that one wants to work for the immediate alleviation of poverty and a gradual elimination of all poverty. What was very important about that Vienna Declaration on Human Rights is that it established a Human Rights Council and that it established something called the Universal Periodic Review, which I'll say something about later, which is sort of a mutual reviewing of the 193 UN member states of each other. It foresees that all countries have sort of equal treatment. It's about sharing human rights practices. And there's no other mechanism of this sort. So this Human Rights Council was a big step forward after the blockages of the Cold War. And because we're looking at, how can we use these human rights conventions, even as we saw very few countries actually, especially on the ILO part, have ratified. We have a group of people who are called special rapporteurs or special reporters, maybe they call themselves special rapporteurs on human rights. And this is a group of people who have a very interesting situation. They are appointed by the UN, by the Human Rights Council. They are not employed by the UN, so they're not accountable to government, so they don't have to sort of speak softly and gently and friendly. And they have to, when they're appointed, they have to have some independent source of income. So most of them happen to be professors at universities and specialized in their area. And there's a special rapporteur on poverty and hunger, on food, on drinking water, education. But there's, I think, currently about 30 special rapporteurs, but these are just some areas, thematic areas that are close to our heart. And since this month, there is a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. So actually saying that we all have a right to a healthy, thriving, sustainable planet, and how can we get there? So these rapporteurs, and I'll give an example later, are quite outspoken, tend to be very outspoken, and they don't have to be abiding by the way human rights UN staff have to be a bit more judicious about how much they attack, especially if they're in a particular country, how much they attack the government, criticize the government. And these rapporteurs actually have open voice, and they tend to be very, very vocal. Now, you might not have heard of the MDGs because most of you are young generation, But the MDGs were adopted in the year the Millennium Summit was in the year 2000, and the MDGs were actually adopted, technically speaking, in 2002. They were building on different UN summits that took place after the end of the Cold War. They also relate to some measures or indicators that the OECD had developed. The MDGs focus very much on social development. There's not so much on economic issues. And decent work only was added in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. Somehow they forgot to have a target on decent work, but later they realized that we cannot eradicate extreme hunger and poverty if people are not in decent employment, including then having social protection. So we see these 8 goals. The MDGs were very much a north versus south kind of approach, saying that the onus, the responsibility for achieving all these different goals and the targets associated with them, the responsibility lay with the low-income countries, and the global north was only in one goal on a global partnership for development, having more official development assistance and a bit of better trade rules. But basically, it was very much a condescending approach in the sense that the fault sort of for poverty, hunger, lack of education, etc., was seen with the governments to be lying with the governments of the low-income countries and not to be a structural issue caused also by the politics of the global north. We also related to summit and to climate and our issue around the planet, a series of climate summits, and a very important one was in 2012, which adopted a text called The Future We Want. And it's important, and that's in the sense that it was 2012, so we had the MDGs going from 2000 to 2015. In 2012, one was thinking, do we do MDGs 0.2, MDGs Roman 2 or something, or do we create something new? And at this climate-related process, one decided to create something new called the Sustainable Development Goals with this 2030 agenda. So now we're moving from 2015 to 2030. And this SDGs, which I'm sure you're all more than aware of, with 17 goals, they combine the MDGs. You will find all of the 8 MDGs in this list. But they're not just social, but also economic and ecological or environmentally oriented. There's a strong role there for the civil society sector, but there's also a very strong role for the private sector, which I think would be something that would be very interesting to discuss when we get to the discussions. Very quickly, 2015 was already a huge movement of refugees and migrants, but they were not really included in the SDG text, in the 2030 text. But one then had in 2018 2 conferences on refugees and on migration and adopted 2 compacts on them. So again, if we look at the results and compare what's happening with the binding and the voluntary agreements, we had seen relatively good take up in terms of ratification for the binding treatments. And if we look at the Universal Periodic Review, which I'll look at in a minute, there's not really, it actually has a very good take up. All countries are using that mechanism, but there's not any way of really tracking what is happening. And we'll talk later also about how the SDGs get looked at, this UN's Agenda for Sustainable Development, which it's with its 17 and SDGs, how do they actually get tracked and monitored and hopefully realized? So main question, how can we use all these norms? It's a whole lot of, it's a whole big package of different references, but the idea is to use these norms, even if they're not ratified in a given country, in a given setting, to hold governments accountable. Using the norms to claim rights, we can use them for peer pressure. We can say, oh, our neighbor country has ratified the Convention on Migrants, has ratified the Convention on Disability or at Homework. Why is my government not doing it? very strong focus in the SDG debates or in the SDG discourse is on social protection, much more than on decent work. And I'm now going to turn to a few examples. So I had mentioned to you the special rapporteurs. So the special rapporteur on poverty in 2019 went to the United Kingdom. So what's interesting about the special rapporteurs, they don't only do their studies on low-income countries, but they also go to high-income countries. And the special rapporteur on poverty, he visited the US and did a very interesting report on the US. And he also went to the United Kingdom, and he observed that there's immense poverty in the United Kingdom, with queues of people waiting outside food banks, people sleeping in the streets, and that there was too little social protection. And he teamed up with this very famous football player, whose name at the moment escapes me, and who is very well known in England and UK in general. And he did a petition to the UK government building on this poverty report of the special rapporteur of the UN, saying that children should at least children should have a right to a school meal as one way of addressing hunger and poverty. And so the government then actually created a website where the population can look for access to school meals, and is it actually being delivered, and report back. So that was one example of using the work of the UN, using the work of a special rapporteur to actually make a change in government policy. Second example is from Uruguay. This Convention on Domestic Workers, this 189 of the year 1996, Uruguay was the first to ratify, but they were also the first country to actually formulate such a convention on the rights of domestic workers. There's a strong trade union movement that preceded the formulation of this convention, supported by the Catholic Church and a trade union of the domestic workers. And you can imagine how difficult it is for domestic workers to actually have a trade union, since their work is very much isolated in the different households. So that already was an achievement. Women's, especially in particular women's movement of the women care workers, they issued a declaration, and there were lots of representatives of domestic workers who would say that, you know, they actually are so important, because if the domestic worker in a middle class, upper class household doesn't work, if she or he doesn't do their work, these professionals actually are stuck. So actually they should use their power much more and say, if we go on a general strike, entire societies would come to a standstill. So this convention was then formulated with a lot of pressure from Uruguay, and they were then, you know, obviously the first country to also ratify this domestic workers convention. But as we saw, not many countries followed, only 30 ratifications so far. But still, it is an example of, in this case, grassroots pressure on the government taking up the issue, taking it to the ILO in this case, and creating a convention and getting formulated. Another example, this is from the special rapporteur who has just started working on the right to human rights and a decent climate. The Philippines now is holding businesses to account, saying that the carbon emitting companies, the petrol companies, are legally and morally liable for the human rights violations. And they point to these big climate catastrophes that the Philippines has experienced in the past, and are now trying to issue claims against the individual companies to compensate the people whose homes and lives and livelihoods have been destroyed. Another example on this question of how do we deal with these global value chains, these global production chains, you might be aware of the situation in Ecuador, where there's this oil exploration by the oil producer Chevron. They used to be called Texaco, and they had lots of oil spills in this whole area of Ecuador. And in addition to oil spills, they had toxic waste from excavating, pulling out the oil out of the ground. And it affected huge numbers of people, 30,000 indigenous people, and also the farmers in the area. And in the initial round, Chevron had to actually pay compensation to the affected, harmed people. But then Chevron took Ecuador to court, and then the Ecuador government was meant to actually pay back to Chevron. The process is quite convoluted. One of the main lawyers is now in prison because he was accused of collusion and corruption. But what is important about this Ecuador case, which is something that happens in so many countries, Nigeria is another case where there's huge international oil companies, multinational oil companies, working to exploiting local people and also poisoning them with the oil emissions. What is important, though, politically about the Ecuador case and the fact that the government was then taken to court by Chevron after initially they had won the case, that in 2014, Ecuador and South Africa started a process at the United Nations, at the Human Rights Council, with government, civil society, trade unions, business associations, and others to use the UN as a forum to create a binding treaty. So this would be obligatory, it would be binding on business and human rights. And there's a very strong group of countries, mainly from the global south, who are working on this treaty. We're now in the third version of the text, and its main core issue is the obligation of states, of governments, to respect, protect, fulfill, and promote human rights by curbing businesses, by making business obey rights standards, human rights standards, labor rights standards, and environmental standards. And we have a parallel process right now in the European Union. And today, there was just the issue of a statement by 220 non-governmental organizations asking the EU to have a good due diligence of binding law on these global production chains. And the idea is, I know this because I'm in this treaty alliance, the idea is for the individual national due diligence laws. Due diligence would be having obligations for companies to abide by labor, human rights, and environmental standards. A few countries have such laws. There's now the movement to have one at the European Union level, and then to take that into the multilateral level with the binding treaty at global level. The EU so far has been not very supportive of a binding treaty at multilateral level, and we're hoping that with these different initiatives of civil society, this is what I mean by sort of pressure, public pressure, we will make the EU have a different stance. And I'll say a bit more in a minute also about another avenue that's being used, namely using the G7 and the G20 summits. In the UN, one is in two minds about the G7 and the G20. These are voluntary associations of countries. This is the most powerful countries in the world if we go by their economic GDP, and partly also by their political power. And the G20, it's a larger group, but both of them are not really legitimate in terms of they're self-appointed. So they're separate from the UN, and a lot of us say we need a G193, the member states of the UN, and not a G7 or a G20. So because they can undermine the UN. But if we're clever, if we, being civil society and progressive governments, are clever, we can actually use these fora to put pressure then again on the other countries and to make change, to achieve change in the UN. And interestingly, both the G7 and the G20 have a ministerial level track, as they call it, the Labor 7, the Civil Society 7, the Women 7, the Think Tank 7, and the same goes for the G20. And also there are alternative summits, but if we look at the current G7, this year's G7 happens to be happening in Germany, and the presidency moves each year. And this is what German government has issued as their programmatic approach to the summit. A sustainable planet, economic stability and transformation. Not sure whether that means just transition. Healthy lives, better future, stronger together. Now, last week, the C7, so this is the civil society groups that are convening in parallel or in preparation rather for the G7 summit of the heads of state, issued a communique last week saying, very important for our discussion on decent work and global value chains, hyperglobalization, deregulated free trade, globalized supply chains, and economic growth at any price are not in everyone's interest. They're only in the interest of a happy few, as they put it. And one needs to establish mandatory environmental, social, and governance due diligence obligations, and one needs to have a binding instrument on business and human rights. Now, this is the civil society part. It's civil society from the C7 countries, from those 7 countries. What we're hoping will happen is when the final communique or statement comes out of the G7 summit, which is in June, that they will actually commit, those 7 countries will commit to having a binding treaty, well, to negotiate a binding treaty on business and human rights. So that would make a huge difference. And apart from the tracks that are convened by the G7 countries or the G20 countries themselves, there's also an alternative process that is separate from the civil society, more, the civil society process attached to the G7. I'm a part of this, and we're organizing an alternative summit, a small alternative summit. This is from 7 years ago, 2015, when it was also in Germany. And again, this year it's going to happen in a mountain resort. This was civil society making public pressure on the G7 countries. We're doing a small alternative summit on globally just economic patterns in times of crisis. So those are different ways of, of Ecuador with the binding treaty process, or using the G7 by civil society, are ways to claim human rights from the UN system, say there are these ideas, there are these commitments, there are these notions of human rights, of environmental rights, of climate rights, that countries in one form or another have actually agreed to or committed to, at least voluntarily, and we need to claim them, we need to remind them, we need to put pressure. Now, on the SDGs, the question is, since they're not binding, how do they actually get implemented? How do they actually get monitored? How do they actually get tracked? So here, there's an interesting process every year. In July, in New York at the General Assembly, there's an annual, there's a high-level political forum, which looks at the voluntary, so as we know, this is not binding, the voluntary national reviews. Every country except the US so far has submitted one of these voluntary national reviews. Some have even already submitted 2 times. So this is since 2016, since the year after the adoption of the SDGs. Voluntary, so it's not binding. Because it's voluntary, there's no set pattern, and countries can be very selective which targets in the goals, which targets they pick up, which ones they ignore. Germany, for instance, has reported twice so far, and they're very good at picking out those targets that are either nationally agreed to work on. Obesity is one example, or that are easy to achieve. Income equality in Germany is pretty good, but wealth inequality is very high. Wealth inequality is not in the reporting of Germany, to give you one example. And the worst part is that authoritarian regimes are using this process for what I call blue washing. Last year in the high-level political forum, North Korea and China reported. The year before, Russia reported. And the UN does not have any way of excluding countries who are not in compliance with one of the key SDGs, number 16, on good governance. So this is a very tricky process. Some people say by having these voluntary reviews, which are meant to be including civil society of each country, it again is a way, like my point about the G7, using the G7 process to put pressure that once a country submits a government submits a very glowing report about its SDG performance, civil society can then say, well, you said in New York at the high level forum that my country is achieving SDG 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the reality on the ground is different. How can we close this disconnect? As we all know, if we use the Human Development, not the SDGs, but the Human Development Index, in 2020, we saw a huge drop in the HDI, in the Human Development Index, for the first time ever. It was always, there were some setbacks, but it was always improvements every year. Last year was the first time there was the setback. So one would think, well, it was the coronavirus pandemic and GDP was going back, etc. But actually, this is from 2019, so before the pandemic, and already the SDG on poverty SDG number one was not on track. More than 90% of deaths due to disasters in low and middle income countries. Still no social protection, which we saw last time, and the number of people in extreme poverty. That improved, but in the meantime, now since 2020, it's been increasing again, the number of people living in poverty. But so my point being that even before the pandemic, we saw that countries were not on track to eliminate poverty, if this is where we want to be, at zero poverty in 2030. Yes, the COVID pandemic, of course, is to blame for all of the setbacks on all of the SDGs. But as I mentioned last time, in my view, the pandemic, it reveals the inequalities and inequities. It's not an excuse for saying, oh, that's why we're off track. And we now have this rhetoric in the UN and lots of member states of the UN saying we need to build back better. I don't think we need to build back. I think we need to build forwards in a very different and more equitable way. So moving to our discussions, should we, seeing this very mixed picture, should we engage with the human rights framework of the UN? If so, how? Can we reinvigorate the UN system? And how can we act for a better future? Let me turn over to you and see whether we can get into a really lively discussion. So thank you so much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. Muchas gracias, Gabriel, por tu exposición. Yo le voy a... Hay unas cuantas preguntas. Lo que voy a hacer, si te parece, Gabriel, es... voy a ir leyendo 3 o 4 para que tú tomes nota y vayas respondiendo a esas, y a medida que surjan más, voy a hacer de traductor, mejor dicho, trasladar esas preguntas a ti. Las voy a leer como están escritas en español. Le voy a pedir a ti y a los traductores que te la traduzcan. Manuel Irizar dice: Gabriela ha mencionado al comienzo de su presentación la importancia de una sociedad justa y transparente para enfrentar el autoritarismo. Me pregunto, ya que en su mapa Argentina aparece en verde, esto es granted, si en lugar de centrarnos solo en el sistema político, legislativo, judicial, no deberíamos también ver el peso o influencia que tienen los medios masivos de comunicación y el capital concentrado, tal como ocurre en mi país. Eso es un tema. La segunda es Laura Peña, dice: hace poco tiempo en un medio de United Kingdom, de Inglaterra, de Gran Bretaña, se reseñaba el efecto de la sequía en el incremento de matrimonios forzados de niñas en una región de África. Junto a ello se llamaba la atención sobre la urgencia de detener la práctica de matrimonios forzados, pero poco sobre el acceso nulo a acueductos en dichas zonas. A propósito de la intersección entre cambio climático, derechos humanos y enfoque de género, ¿qué opinión le merece la aproximación de los medios del norte global sobre la agenda de los países del sur global? Es decir, hay dos temas que relacionan el tema o la importancia que tienen los medios en la construcción de agenda pública o agenda política. Y aquí pone la fuente del artículo a la cual se refería, que fue publicada por The Guardian, y se refiere a la sequía en Etiopía. Y agrega, y cómo el marco de las agencias de Naciones Unidas puede influir o no en este asunto. La tercera pregunta, por ahora, es la de Nicolette Molina, que propone o señala o pregunta cómo el enfoque de desarrollo humano contribuye al cumplimiento y desarrollo de normativas o políticas públicas que fomenten el cumplimiento de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. ¿De qué manera sería un incentivo para los hacedores de política integrar este enfoque? Vamos a parar por ahora por ahí y tú vas respondiendo.
Okay. Okay, very interesting questions. On the role of the media, I think that's a very good point, because I've been focusing more on NGOs in the sense of activist NGOs and not looking at and not talking about media. And we know that there's all these issues around, I don't know, Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, I think people are using as well. That sort of change, influence, manipulate, if you will, public opinion. And many people will be in a, as you know, in a bubble reading their particular form of, or their particular media and trusting them. And there's also this big divide between access to information, depending on how much internet access a person or a community has. We didn't look at the digital divide, but if we look at the access to, you know, even just a smartphone, that is a smartphone in the sense of being able to access the internet, having internet connectivity. We see a strong north-south divide. We see a strong divide between higher income and lower income countries. And we see a gender divide, and we see a rural-urban divide. So the more disadvantaged a community is, the less access they will have, and also the less time to begin with to surf the internet and look for alternative forms of information, and then to question what is actually there. And so I think you have a good point. In that map, actually one of the criteria of Civicus, of that human rights NGO, one of the criteria for their characterizing a country as closed or repressed, etc., is whether there's open media. As we know, so many journalists are being killed, but also so many human rights and climate rights activists are being killed. But I think it's a good point to say we need to pay a lot of attention if we want to argue for human rights and agitate for human rights, to look at what is the media influence. On messages that come, they're very selective, and I too read The Guardian every day, and to contrast it, I also read Al Jazeera, and I find that there's very different kinds of perspectives on very many different issues. The forced marriage topic has come to the front, but actually I think the forced marriage issue actually came to get a lot of attention in the global North's media because of UNICEF and I think UNFPA, the Fund for Population Activities, and UN Women, those three UN agencies, raising attention to that that question. But of course, but in these articles, one also often has a very shortened and not very analytical approach. So it's about income poverty, but not about water scarcity or water poverty or time poverty. It's about hunger, but not about the whole conglomerate of a situation facing low-income countries. And in the case of Ethiopia in particular, it's also added by the civil war that's happening there at the moment. And you were asking, what can the UN do? In countries with very acute civil war, such as in parts of Ethiopia, the UN actually doesn't have access. The UN agencies don't have access, or in Myanmar similarly. So there's very limited ability of the different UN agencies on the ground to do anything. The other question was on the human development paradigm and SDGs, and that's an extremely interesting conceptual question. The Human Development Index is, of course, a composite, right? So it's the life expectancy, the education levels, and GDP per capita and its development. But because it puts those three factors together and has one index, what is very useful in the Human Development Index is that it ranks countries. You can't do that with the SDGs. You can't rank countries because they would need to be ranked by the 17 different SDG outcomes, well, by 170 targets, and so it doesn't work. Whereas the HDI, you actually, as you know, have these lists of countries. And what I found politically is that countries that are in competition with each other, if they drop on the list of the HDI performance, they actually get very agitated. So it's a good way of putting pressure on governments to do something about social and economic and poverty and climate policy. And recently the HDI has been augmented with actually looking at climate change factors. I think last year's report about the Anthropocene, so it's becoming very differentiated. And we also have the gendered HDI. So politically, as an instrument of pressure, and that relates a bit back to the media question also, the HDI is probably more useful than the SDGs because it's simplistic in a way. And the and it's interesting, one could have adopted after the MDGs, one could have said we adopt the Human Development Index as the criterion for social and economic progress. But one didn't, one decided to go with these 17 areas. And I would say there's a bit of competition in a way between those parts of the UN that use the SDGs and those parts that use the Human Development Index. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Ok, bueno, vamos a ver qué dice la audiencia. Yo solamente voy a seguir con las preguntas, pero quería acotar algo que ocurrió hace relativamente poco tiempo y que me parece que es un muy pequeño avance, pero avance al fin, que es el debate sobre la tributación de las corporaciones internacionales. Que ustedes saben que en función de donde declaran qué sucede, que normalmente la sede de las grandes corporaciones están vinculadas en lo que se llaman paraísos fiscales, en donde pagan muy pocos impuestos, es un mecanismo de evasión, puesto que de ese modo evitan pagar impuestos a las ganancias, impuestos a la riqueza en los países en donde están y obtienen sus recursos. Y se llegó finalmente a una propuesta de que había como homogeneizar una tasa global de un 15%, si mal no me equivoco, y quería recordar esto a Gabriel como una línea que es muy importante. Hoy en la mañana, en una mesa redonda, surgió, tú como economista del desarrollo, debes compartir muchísimo la mirada de los clásicos de la economía de bienestar, que decían que la primer política social es la política fiscal. En un en un mundo de globalización con las cadenas de valor, que pueda haber una convención global sobre cuál es el nivel de tributación mínima o media que en todos los países en donde operan las corporaciones tienen que tributar, me pareció que es una línea importante en términos de construir una mayor justicia distributiva. Ahora voy a leerte las otras preguntas que estuvieron llegando. Una es de Gonzalo Vaz, vinculados a los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, y es si se puede pensar como posibilidad para el cumplimiento paulatino de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, conseguir que el sistema de Naciones Unidas comprometa a los gobiernos en el diseño y cumplimiento de sus presupuestos gubernamentales en favor de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Luego, Paola Aristizábal, que agradece la presentación, pregunta cuáles serían las estrategias de control que desde el enfoque de desarrollo humano podrían aplicarse en los distintos países que que suscriben estas propuestas, pues en el caso latinoamericano existen países que, pese a haberse comprometido y firmarlos, presentan grandes y enormes índices de desigualdad. Es decir, una gran distancia o diferencia entre suscribir un acuerdo y después efectivamente cumplirlo. Típico, además, esto es una acotación personal mía, lo mismo ocurre en América Latina, no solo con los acuerdos internacionales y las convenciones de derechos humanos, sino con muchas leyes y principios consagrados en las constituciones de nuestros países y que forman parte del cuerpo jurídico y normativo y que, sin embargo, no se cumplen, ¿no? Romina Victoria Hernández dice, ¿podría decirnos en términos generales en qué cantidad de países, por continente o por región, cuáles son los que han ratificado la Convención de los Migrantes y sus familias y por qué considera que la adhesión a esta convención es tan baja comparadas con, por ejemplo, la alcanzada por la CEDAW o la Convención de los Derechos de los Niños?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. Let me start with the last one because that's the easiest one. I think the one on migrants and families, because it actually says that migrants have a right to decent work. It has a right, they're meant to move from the informal to the formal economy, which would have lots of implications for their status, for their contracts, for where they work, how they work, etc. And it's the right for a migrant worker to bring her or his family to the country where they're working. And I think it's not being ratified because governments don't want to give these rights to migrants. I think governments are quite happy to have this invisible workforce, which handles a lot of the care work, a lot of the global production chain work at very low wages, makes a country as such competitive economically because of the low costs of production. And so if they would ratify this convention on the rights of migrants and their families, the families would have a right to social protection in the country where the migrant worker is located. So the country would be less competitive economically. And I think it's just a very egotistical position of countries to not ratify. And that's why we only have, 30 countries that have ratified that convention so far. And it's something that leads not, the other part of it is, I think your point about the earlier point about media is important. It doesn't get so much attention in the media. But another point is that migrants, it's very, very difficult for migrants to actually organize in a given country where they're working, to actually organize and say, we want this convention to be ratified in the country where I'm now working, because they're not citizens, they're residents, they don't have voting rights, etc. So I think it's several factors together. I'm not quite sure, I didn't quite understand the question about how do we, with the SDGs, designing government policy. Some countries actually do use the 17 SDGs. Those countries that have a national development plan, they do sometimes organize their national development plan around the SDGs. Latvia is an example. They have a 5-year, I think, development plan. I guess they don't call it development plan, social plan or something. And they actually use the SDGs as their organizing framework. Many countries in the global south, not many, some countries in the global south are doing it. And Germany, interestingly, as an example, also has a national development strategy, a national sustainable development strategy around the 17 SDGs. But as mentioned, concentrating on those that are either easy to achieve or that the government actually might be difficult to achieve, but the government actually already has singled them out. But so that's one, but I'm not sure if that was your question, because it was about the gradual compliance. I didn't quite understand that. But let me, yes, and then the question, this gap between ratifying and then actually implementing and fulfilling the spirit of the norm. So even for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, as I mentioned, almost every country has ratified, and still we see so many countries with child labor, which is, one of the core ideas of not having child labor, but it's also about inequalities in education, inequalities in access to health services, and how can a country ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child and not do something about it? And I think part of the implementation challenge or difficulty is that not enough fiscal spending is then spent on the implementation. So for child labor to not happen, one would need to have factory inspectorates. Where do factories get the inputs from? And if they're sourcing from outside the factory, from homework, where does this homework come from, and are children involved? Where do the mining products come from? Are children involved? And so part of the implementation gap is because there's not enough funding putting into actually monitoring the realization of that particular convention. The same for CEDAW and others. And then that brings me to this question of taxation. Recently, I think it's at the OECD level, if I'm not mistaken, one has agreed on this 15% homogeneous tax. But it's, first of all, that's much too low, because if one wants to have a good, well-functioning, well-oiled, redistributive welfare state, one needs a much higher tax to GDP ratio. So one would also have to have much higher tax rates on companies. The original proposal was actually 25%, not 15%, and then it was negotiated down. So that's one part, it's much too low. And the second issue is that even if this is now a new agreement that I think it was the OECD countries, that if they comply with that, the mechanics are such that actually the tax revenue then goes to the original home country of the transnational corporation. So it doesn't actually, so if there's a company, a TNC producing a lot in Argentina, and they agree to this 15% tax rate, but the 15% actually go, if it's an American company operating in Argentina, then that 15% tax, corporate tax, goes to the US as the home country and not to Argentina as the actual location. So it's very deceiving on what's actually been achieved. In the UN context, there's a financing for development process, which actually started in, is it Monterrey, somewhere in Latin America? Also now about 20 years ago. Someone who's very prominent, and I'm sure Pablo knows him, is Jose Antonio Ocampo, who used to be the head of ECLAC also. He's been very, very vocal on this tax issue, and what many civil society actors and also many academics, Stiglitz and others, are arguing for is a global UN-based tax body that would look at tax rates. Where does tax revenue actually go to? How does one close all those tax havens and make sure that companies are not using the lowest, the location with the lowest tax rates? How does one do away with corruption, etc.? But as I say, it's been going on for 20 years. They just met last week. And again, through the G7 process now, this Financing for Development group is trying to get the G7 countries to adopt a commitment to create a UN-based tax body, and not a tax body that's only in the OECD countries, which is, again, a small group. Yeah, I think those were the questions, right? But please come back if I didn't answer what you meant.
Gabriele, thanks a lot. I think that you have been very clear in your answers. And at least my image at the end of your conference and the two sessions is that tenemos un contexto muy complejo, con final abierto, diríamos. El sistema de Naciones Unidas que se construyó luego de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y que dio lugar a los que son conocidos como los 30 años gloriosos, a partir del cual se habilitó este edificio tan relevante de reconocimiento de derechos y de expansión de derechos que tú bien mencionaste, entró en crisis con la irrupción del capital financiero en una nueva etapa de desarrollo del capitalismo a nivel global. Y si bien creo que todas las agencias de Naciones Unidas cumplen un papel importante, del cual podríamos imaginar si sería mejor o peor el mundo si prescindimos de ellas, y creo que la mayor parte de nosotros va a decir que no, que son importantes, que cumplen un rol. Quizás muchas de las agencias podrían redefinirse, podrían fusionarse, reducir de algún modo porque tienen límites muy, muy comunes, y de ese modo también mejoraría su eficacia y eficiencia. Pero también, por haber trabajado también muchos años en Naciones Unidas, finalmente Naciones Unidas, como su nombre lo indica, desde el punto de vista de su construcción política, es la reunión de todos los países del mundo. Y desde su creación se reconocieron de algún modo países de primera y países de segunda. Los países de primera son solamente 5, que son los que integran el Consejo de Seguridad, que eran los emergentes del poder militar económico que sobrevivió, que vino en el mundo después de la Segunda Guerra. Por cierto, no todos, porque Japón y Alemania, que hoy son potencias económicas, como fue después de la Segunda Guerra, y fueron perdedores, no fueron incluidos dentro del Consejo de Seguridad. Tampoco son incluidos países que tienen un gran peso demográfico en el mundo, como la India, y otros países muy relevantes en otras regiones, como es el caso de Brasil, en América Latina, que representa desde el punto de vista demográfico un poco menos que la mitad de los países de América Latina y el Caribe, o países de mucha importancia e influencia en África, que no están considerados. Y bueno, existen llamadas para una reforma de la arquitectura de Naciones Unidas para dar mayor representatividad y representación a los países del sur frente a los países del norte. De hecho, actualmente, y desde la emergencia de China como gran potencia económica, y la actual crisis producida por la invasión de Rusia muestra un mundo bastante más multipolar. ¿Cómo conformar unas Naciones Unidas que puedan servir como un control o una regulación a esta globalización y que ayude a construir un mundo más justo, de menor niveles de desigualdad? Es quizás la gran pregunta que nos corresponde a cada uno de los países y a cada una de las sociedades poder tratar de ayudar a construir. Por cierto, en un mundo global uno necesita, y concentrado en cada vez menos manos, como nos mostró en un slide el día lunes Gabriel, 80 personas concentran la misma riqueza que la mitad de la población del mundo. Entonces, ¿cómo combatir esta injusticia distributiva? Uno necesita pensar en un organismo internacional que reúna los intereses de las mayorías demográficas del mundo. Obviamente que esta arquitectura de Naciones Unidas no es la que se muestra hasta ahora más eficaz. La pandemia lo demostró, no hubo una respuesta global pese a los esfuerzos de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, que incluso sufrió una merma en su financiamiento por parte de Estados Unidos en plena pandemia. Tuvo más cooperación de una empresa privada, de una gran corporación como es la fundación de Gates, que del propio Estado norteamericano. Y bueno, estas son las tensiones y los grandes temas que afectan y que van limitando esta arquitectura internacional y las necesidades de pensar y construir algo diferente. Lo que creo que no podemos ni debemos, todos quienes defendemos los derechos humanos, que de algún modo establecen un marco de vinculación que reconoce un funcionamiento pacífico de las sociedades, reconoce los derechos de todas y todos, de minorías, etcétera, etcétera, tengamos que tirarlo o ponerlo en riesgo frente a la desazón que supone un adecuado funcionamiento de ciertas instituciones. Así que yo concluiría esta sesión. Vamos a seguir discutiendo estas cosas. El día de mañana, a las 5 de la tarde, vamos a tener una primera presentación de alguien que es muy conocido, de Gabriel, a través de quien yo conocí a Gabriel, que es Alberto Simadamore, que él va a presentar en 2 sesiones algo de estos temas. Va a profundizar el tema de pobreza, cómo se evalúa, cómo se mide, qué es lo que implica, el rol estratégico en términos de una construcción para una justicia global más equitativa. Y también va luego a presentar qué es esto de sostenibilidad, y lo va a plantear incluso desde el punto de vista epistemológico, como lo que él denomina la ciencia, él y otras, la ciencia de la sostenibilidad. Finalmente, ya que lo mencionaste, Gabriel, José Antonio Campo fue conferencista nuestro en el seminario del año pasado, y muchos de quienes están aquí hoy lo han escuchado, y sus presentaciones estuvieron y están disponibles en el website del programa para quienes quieran hacerlo. Una de sus presentaciones fue justamente sobre la importancia de construir una institución que trate de plantear y proponer una tasa tributaria de tributación de las multinacionales, tal como señaló Gabriel. Y a ti, Gabriel, agradecerte de nuevo muchísimo tu contribución, tu participación. Estás invitada a venir cuando podamos hacerlo presencialmente. Te vamos a recibir aquí en la Argentina y en América Latina con los brazos abiertos. Muchísimas gracias, desearte buenas noches y a todos ustedes nos vemos mañana a las 5 de la tarde para seguir con el seminario. Chau, chau. Gracias, Gabriel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And stay well, everyone, please. Okay, thank you so much for having me. Bye-bye.